Well, it's 7 o'clock and we've got a lot of stuff to cover tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm going to do a little intro here while people still file in and get their computers set up. Welcome to tonight's Farminar. I am Steve Carlson. I work with Practical Farmers of Iowa as a beginning farmer and program associate, and I'll be the host tonight along with Megan Filbert. So tonight we're glad to have a couple of PFI members who know what they're talking about when it comes to the two topics of livestock grazing and cover crops. So a lot of knowledge with us tonight. So think of your questions as we go through and take advantage of these guys that we got with us. First up, we've got Joe Sellers with us, who is with ISU Extension and the Iowa Beef Center, and he also helps to manage a family farm in Lucas County. And then along with Joe, we have Tim Palmer of Truro, Iowa, who raises corn, soybean, oats, hay, and rotationally grazed beef cattle. And Tim is active in both local and national conservation organizations and serves as a commissioner in his local soil and water conservation district. And so together these guys are going to discuss herbicide restrictions that you should consider when you're grazing cover crops or harvesting them for forage. So before I turn it over to these guys, though, I'm going to do a quick little introduction about PFI. So this is part of our winter Farminar series. We do these about every Tuesday night during the fall and the winter months. And these are the remaining topics that we've got going into the middle of March. So mark your calendar for any of those that look interesting. If you happen to miss any of these Farminars, we do have them archived on our website. There's hundreds of these Farminars archived on our website with a nice handy dandy search tool, so you can go in there if you have any topics that you're curious about and dig through and look for other stuff that's in that Farminar or in the archives there. So if you're not familiar with Practical Farmers of Iowa, we started back in 1985. We've been celebrating our 30th anniversary over the past year. We're a nonprofit organization that's made up of farmers and friends of farmers, and our members are, like I said, farmers and friends of farmers, and our farmers come from farms of all sizes and all enterprises, and from across the state of Iowa and much beyond the state of Iowa as well. Our mission at PFI is to strengthen farms and communities through farmer-led investigation and information sharing. We've stayed true to this mission for many years, and we use this to focus on helping farmers practice an agriculture that benefits both the land and the people. Our values at PFI are welcoming everyone, creativity, collaboration, and community, viable farms now and for future generations, and stewardship and ecology. So you can join Practical Farmers of Iowa. We are a big tent. We're proud of the fact that we have such a diverse group of members. And if you tap into our membership, you can, first of all, use our membership as a network of people to bounce ideas off of. So you can get our newsletters and be on our discussion lists, which is really the main benefit, is just being a part of this community of people who you can work with and learn from. You also get discounts to our events. You get opportunity to participate in our programming, like our on-farm research that we do in our cooperators program. We have beginning farmer programs that you can tap into as well. So there's a lot of benefits of joining Practical Farmers of Iowa. You can get all that information on our website. The fees are super reasonable. It pays for itself real quick, and it's really just an investment in your career as a farmer. So this time of year, even though it is maybe the off season for some of you, maybe not if you're in livestock, but we have tons of events, and we have a calendar on our website that lists all these events. So this is just a screenshot from February. You can see there's just loads of stuff going on. So this is just not just PFI events, but our partner events as well. One of the things that we've got coming up, it's about a week and a half away. That's a big PFI event that I'm excited about, is our next generation retreat for beginning farmers. If you're interested in that, you can find that on our website as well. It's a great opportunity to learn from other farmers and to network with each other and just to have a good, fun weekend with other farmers. So before we get started here, just some quick rules. Thank you everybody for typing your information into the chat box. Like I said, we do use that for grant reporting and to help do evaluations on these Farminars, and the feedback that you give us helps guide the topics of our future Farminars. So I'll be sending out an email after this with a link to do a survey. So if you don't mind taking that, we really value your feedback. As a farmer-led organization, that's what we look for. The chat box that you're typing in right there is also what we use for our questions. So if you have questions for our presenters tonight, then go ahead and type them in the chat box. If our presenters see your question and they want to answer it at that time, that's fine, but we are going to reserve the final 30 minutes for questions. So if your question doesn't get answered when you ask it, Megan and I will make sure that we circle back and get to that at the end of the night. Like I said earlier, we are recording this Farminar, so if you want to share this with some friends or rewatch it, we'll have that available on our website. So now I'm going to pull up Joe's presentation here and let Joe Sellers take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll go ahead and get started then. One thing I want to say at the start here is that some of the information I'm going to use today was some things I got from a talk that Mary Janowski did at our 3-state beef conference. So that's one thing about being an extension, you share things back and forth, and that's the good deal about it. So I'll mention that as we go through. This is really an exciting time, with annual forage crops. Certainly it's nothing new. I mean, people have used a lot of these crops for a long time. It's just got a lot more involved and a lot more people doing it now than there was not very long ago. And we think a lot of times about things like rye or something like that that's very simple, but it could be a lot of other different crops that we could be using. And a lot of the stuff we're doing so far has been based on really for agronomics, for soil health. Certainly originally we used all this stuff pretty much for reducing soil erosion, and now we're thinking more and more about soil health and tilth. But we need to kind of contrast a little bit the difference between annual forage crops and cover crops, because a cover crop kind of infers that it's just something there to kind of cover the soil. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have that forage use for livestock. When we make that next step, then it's really a double crop and using that for a forage for livestock, which is great. And that's, I think, one of the things that could be really good incentive for us down the road to get more use out of these cover crops or annual forage crops. But it's really a concern if we worry about these herbicide issues that we're going to talk about today. So these annual forage crops historically have been used for cover crops following grain crops, certainly companion crops for new seedings. We use them for a smother crop in some of our renovation strategies on fescue. I think we're going to see more and more people maybe even use a double crop of 2 of these forage crops that are annuals, with the idea of maybe getting more quality that they need for certain type of higher energy requirement type cattle or any kind of animal, any kind of ruminant. So I think we'll probably see more of that. Today we're going to focus mostly though on if you really followed along with following a grain crop. And it's really important that we look at that crop rotation interval. And there's 4 reasons I guess we're going to talk about a little bit here why cash crop herbicide selection is important if you're going to look at cover crops, is that the residuals in the soil actually can stunt the growth of that next crop. And that's the first thing you might think about, even for the agronomic uses, will the next crop even grow? And when I was working first with rye maybe 30 years ago on my farm, and we put rye in after corn silage, we just were worried about how much herbicide could be on there before, like atrazine or lasso or dual, and have that rye really come up and be successful. We might have done a bioassay to be sure it would be successful, but that's really not the only issue. The issue also is it legal to graze or harvest that forage after you've put a herbicide on? And so the residue could be taken up by that cover crop, double crop, and be toxic to the cattle. So in theory, it could even be a problem that's a problem with the cattle. Certainly it could be a problem with residues in the fat that might show up later on to detection. But honestly, the biggest problem most likely is nobody's ever done the research to show to set a harvest interval on all these crops. So maybe they'd have a harvest interval for following soybeans with wheat, but they might not have it with all those other kind of crops. Or maybe there's no harvest interval established for any of these crops. And that's one of our biggest problems, I think, and we've kind of ignored it at this point. And I'm not sure we can continue to ignore the fact that there are restrictions on how we use some of these herbicides and then follow up with an annual forage crop. And then, I think it makes a little difference on what you want to have in your mix of forage crops. If you're trying to look at really honestly and following our area, and I know Sarah Carlson's talked a lot about that, there's a limit how much growing season we're going to have after this soybean or corn crop. So maybe we're going to focus a lot on the grasses and the brassicas because we know we have more success with those. It's nice to have the mix because you get more biomass and more use of the sunlight and really use it. But I'm not sure that we have a lot of data to show it's necessary to have a real huge cocktail mix of some of these things. And especially if you're going to use it for a forage crop, then the more different combinations you put in there that are not on a label, the more complicated that gets for you to find a herbicide program you could use on crop A when you're going to follow it with this forage crop B. And so there's going to be these restrictions if they follow another crop. And some herbicides also restrict grazing even the target crop residue, like harvesting it for corn silage or grazing the stalks. But even beyond that, a lot of it is these second crops because nobody's really done the research to show if that's a problem or not. And nobody probably will because a lot of these herbicides now are generic deals in tank mixes, and nobody's going to really spend a lot of time to relicense those probably. It doesn't affect these double cropping forage situations like I mentioned before. If you're grazing, a summer annual then falling out to a winter annual and doing a continuous rotation like that and not doing that cash grain crop, then probably that doesn't interfere at all with that. And also that's the problem with organic systems. Certainly if herbicides aren't involved, then you're not concerned about which herbicide you put on. And so I think there's really two different ways you might look at it. Do you want to graze in the fall? If you're wanting to graze in the fall, then you're probably going to use some really things that are winter sensitive and aren't going to overwinter because you're going to get more production in the fall for grazing if you plant something like oats or other spring small grains or some of the brassicas, and that may be something you can do to get more production that first year. Obviously we're trying to focus mostly on the herbicides today, but I do also want to mention that there could also be some additional animal health concerns with some of these forages, especially if they're just too lush. If you use something to try to really scavenge as much nitrogen as you can, then you may have higher protein levels than you really want. Some of these crops I'm going to show you in a minute can be extremely high in energy, so you almost need to have one of these mixtures of a crop that's high energy and a crop that has more fiber to ensure we get good rumen function, have the cattle really perform right. And then also sometimes they can have too high sulfur, and I apologize for a misspelling on sulfur. I do know how to spell it, we just didn't get it right in this particular slide. This will kind of show you what I mean by how some of these could be and how some of these different crops might operate. An example would be looking at the tops of radishes and looking in November or December or the tops of turnips, and they could easily be close to 30% crude protein, but they also could be 80% total digestible nutrients, which is hard to believe that would be that high, isn't it? I mean, that's amazingly high. So 28 to 27 on that, maybe even 29 to even higher than that, possibly on the turnips. This is again work from Nebraska. But then that's why having oats in there could be an advantage. It would be a little lower in protein at that same stage. Also, energy. When you start talking about being 80% TDN, corn is only 90% TDN. So realistically, that's extremely high in digestible carbohydrates. And when that happens, then maybe it's really going to help to have some other things with more fiber to reduce that energy when you're trying to graze it. So, look at the amount of total fiber of NDF in those radish tops. But now if we have oats in there instead, then that'll get it up there to more fiber. So that's why it's really a good idea to mix those grasses with those brassicas and try to maybe impact that. And the other thing that we've never really thought too much about is some of these brassicas can be extremely high in sulfur, and we worry a lot about sulfur. Certainly we think about it with co-products that we use from the ethanol industry, that sometimes that can be pretty high in sulfur, but this is really about twice the tolerable limit, or even a little more than twice the tolerable limit on cattle with those sulfur levels. Now if you have high fiber, that isn't nearly as bad as it would be if something didn't have a lot of fiber in it, but still it shows you that maybe there's a concern there that we should even think about having that grass mixed in there just to reduce that amount of sulfur. I personally cannot tell of any times I knew of that were really directly attributed to those high sulfur levels hurting ruminant animals grazing those brassicas, but we have had people talk about some kind of toxicities that occur sometimes with those, whether it's overload, whether it's too high energy, or whether it's the sulfur, who knows. but I think it shows you that there's a big advantage to have that mix in there. And then even looking at some other tables following wheat in Nebraska, you can see that there's a lot of difference in different types of levels of that based on the root and leaves. And again, if we have that oats mixed in there, it does kind of help a lot on reducing the amount of just way more energy than we need for certain kind of animals. So that's why, you know, it probably makes sense to have that mix, and we've been lucky that we've been doing those mixes in a lot of cases. This also kind of shows you the proportion of the plant that's in the root or leaves on different types of those plants when we're talking about the brassicas. So if we have the mix of the grasses and brassicas, we'll have a balanced nutrient level, we'll have less worry with sulfur. Certainly we also may need to be too careful if too much nitrogen is out there. So if your goal with planting this cover crop is to capture all the nitrogen it can, then it's a potential that you could have more nitrogen that you really want those animals to eat and may need to dilute that in some way. Then we talked a little bit about for fall, you're probably going to want to have those ones that won't be winter tolerant. But if you want to do spring grazing primarily, then you're going to want to put those kind of plants in there that will overwinter, at least in portion. And I think there's a lot of possibilities of doing both, having some oats in there and also having some rye. So you have some fall grazing and having some spring. The winter, cereal grains that are the winter grains are not going to give you as much production in the fall, but they will do much more in the spring. Certainly a lot of opportunities out here between corn silage fields like we talked about that were chopped, early harvested soybean fields, seed corn fields, things like that can be great opportunities to get those plants planted out there. Maybe get a little bit in the fall, but especially get a lot in the spring. Nebraska has a really nice publication, and later in the presentation you can see the link for that. I would take a look at that because they're doing quite a bit of work now on looking at these crops. And one advantage obviously they have in Nebraska is they're irrigated. They can be sure they got enough moisture when they want the moisture. They can put nutrients on there when they want the nutrients on there. So it's a little easier for them to manage in a lot of locations maybe than it is for us. So let's think about how some of these crops could work and some of the advantages. Well, certainly we think they're going to reduce the soil erosion, increase organic matter, improve soil structure, and all the other things. But I think really the forage issue is something we want to do more with if we can. We're very interested, I think, in having the forage issue and trying to use forages. And I think a lot of us believe that to really keep this be sustainable and keep doing it for a long time, it's going to be more likely to work if people can actually harvest some feed from these annual crops as well as getting the agronomics. So if let's think about if you're really wanting to graze, then I think the thing that's probably the best for the soil. I think grazing probably does. There's going to be a webinar I see in March from USDA work they've done to show that we don't lose those benefits from the cover crops if we do graze, and I think we all believe that. But if you are harvesting it for feed and removing it, that's quite different. You got to remove those nutrients. You're taking quite a bit of the information stuff off of there. So really depends on the year, a lot on the year on when you can get done. Can you harvest it or can you graze it? My background when I was farming and putting a lot of these cover crops on was with sheep, and I think they were a lot more forgiving. The soils were if you were running some lambs or some ewes out there grazing than a 1,500-pound cow. I think when it's muddy, and boy, there's a lot of times in southern Iowa it's muddy, then you're going to have to be careful when you're grazing it in the spring. And then if you are harvesting it instead, then this is again driving back the fact that if you actually remove it, then you got to put those nutrients back somehow. And that could be hauling the feed right back out there, but it also could be with other fertilizers you'd add. So let's hone in on what I was really supposed to talk about a little bit more here, which is the restrictions for the cover crops. Most corn and soybean herbicides do not restrict if all you're using it is just for the agronomics. Usually most of those herbicides will say, as long as I'm not using it for feed, and you want to put it out there and put a cover crop to try to protect the soil, that's not going to be a problem. So that's not really our issue. Our issue more is for the forage crop side. And most herbicides have harvest restrictions for a second rotational forage crop. But if they, and some of them may not be very long. Unfortunately, the ones that aren't very long are some of the ones that we're having some trouble, I think, with the herbicide resistance. And that's why we're going to have a plan if we're going to try to make sure we're covering both deals. That's why Dr. Hartzler and a couple of agronomists, Megan and Rebecca, worked on coming up with this publication, which lists a lot of the herbicides and breaks them down on both corn and soybean herbicides and which ones can have a cover crop that can be planted for feed within 4 months or somewhere between 4 and 5 months. That'll help you when you plan, especially if you want to really take this seriously and think about what type of herbicides can I use and really not worry about not following the label. And so this is kind of an example of what the table looks like. It'll give you some ideas of which ones kind of work for different types of crops. If there's nothing listed on there, so let's say you've got a species like buckwheat or some kind of a brassica, and it's not on there, then it's going to be the longest planting and harvest interval that you have on the label. And a lot of times that could be 18 months. So just because it's not on the label, don't assume that means it's all right. That really means that you're going to have to follow the longest restriction. And many of these cocktail mix ingredients just are not on that list. So that's why it's really important that you read the label and think about what can I do and still go ahead and harvest this for forage and legally harvest it for forage. And that may mean that you're going to have to plan places you want to graze. So let's say you've got a lot of different fields that you might put annual forage crops on and cover crops, but maybe you just want to graze about 20% of those. If you can come up with a rotation and use a herbicide that'll really work for that within the window, then you could probably plan far enough out to be able to get the herbicide used you want to use, not have the weed problems that you might expect, and also go ahead and use that. So, and especially keep track of the fields with long harvest restrictions, because just because you used a herbicide this year, it may mean that even next year you can't plant that cover crop if it has a really long restriction. And that's something that a lot of people aren't thinking about. So here's some examples of some of these cover crops and seeding rates and when you might plant them. Certainly I think we all know that there's lots of opportunities for lots of different crops. People are using a lot of different things. When we talked a little bit earlier about that, some of those being almost too rich for the cattle, this is another solution, is have some dry hay that's not even really that high quality out there, just to lower the rate of passage, get some more fiber in there. If you're really concerned about there being not enough fiber in the diet, this may be one of the ways you can do it when you're grazing one of these annual crops. Like I mentioned earlier, it could be a combination not only of those winter crops, which would typically be the cereal grains and those brassicas, but also some of these situations where you got summer annuals like millet or sorghum sudan, lots of other combinations that could be things you could use. Again, another table that kind of shows you some of the seeding rates and what you expect. The thing to keep in mind that on these yields is when we talk about these cereal grains and we get to the spring, there's just a tremendous difference in quality based on when it's grazed or when it's harvested. And I have samples this year from producers I work with on harvested triticale wheat or rye that can be anywhere from 7 to 14% crude protein and anywhere from 52, 53, 54% TDN up in the mid-60s based on when it's harvested. So tremendous amount of difference in the quality and the amount of digestibility of those in the spring based on when you use them. Now, we mentioned earlier that here's some of the publications that we have that are out there on our website. We have the Iowa State Pub, and this is something that I know that he's going to have that uploaded on the website. You can get to pretty easily. So the one that Dr. Hartzler worked on the restrictions is going to be there. This is Nebraska publications. You can go find that as well. I think it's pretty valuable. And also, you may want to look at the Iowa Learning Farms website, because they have a section on cover crops, and that's going to include some publications that PFI is helping put together with Iowa Learning Farms on, for example, grazing spring cover crops. That'll be one that'll be coming up pretty soon, and best management practices. So that could be a good thing for you to look at. And so those are, and besides the fact that Practical Farmers has an awful lot of these resources right there on their website as well. So, we'd like to find more and more ways to get these cover crops established at the right time. I think we also know that we need to continue to find ways to get it planted earlier. I didn't spend much time on that because that wasn't the topic today. But certainly we got a lot of data to show the earlier you can get that planted and established, the more production you're going to get if your goal is really a forage crop. So, these kind of projects that Sarah and other people are working on to try to look at how we can establish those earlier really will help. One thing I'd mention on our issue with the herbicides is that, we certainly, I'm a little too simplistic on this deal because I kind of come from the animal background, and I know if you're talking about treating lambs with some kind of antibiotic because that's the only thing you can use that works, and it's only available for cattle, then veterinarians have what they call an extra label use for those antibiotics, which is great. So you can actually find an antibiotic that will help your animal even if it's not technically on the label. Unfortunately, that's completely different with these type of herbicides. If it's not listed, it's not going to be something you can do. It's going to be very difficult to get a special use deal, and especially since there's so many different combination of products, it'd be hard to know where to start on getting herbicides approved to be able to use on these corn and soybeans crops and still be able to go back and then graze that annual forage crop that you follow it with. That's one of our real big challenges. So we may need to start at least with looking at what products are legal, see if we can find a combination that makes that work, start planning ahead of time, and that's why it's a good time to talk about it now, because we need to make that decision before these herbicides go on this spring, and that'll give you an opportunity to do a little better job. So I apologize for my voice failing on you here. Hopefully you can at least hear me and understand at least part of what I'm saying. So thank you very much for your time. I think I'm a little bit ahead of time, but I think we can go ahead if you want to, Steve, and we'll move on over to Tim if you'd like to.
Yeah, sounds good, Joe. Thanks a lot. Thanks for going through that. I'm pulling up Tim's presentation right now, but everybody who's watching along, feel free to think up your questions for Joe and get them ready to put in the chat box, because we'll have plenty of time to go through questions with both Joe and Tim. But now I've got Tim's up, so if Tim's ready, we can let him take this away.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Thanks for your presentation, Joe. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So
Yep.
I've adapted this this PowerPoint from another one I've given that looks at cover crops in general, but I've been a long time advocate for that extra use of cover crops that forage producers might have to change that forage into direct manure or something like that'll be available to a crop exactly, or more immediately by running it through the animal and making the best use of it in that way. So a lot of my presentation you'll be aware of is coming from my experience in relationships with the national water quality and soil health efforts, and knowledge of what's going on here in Iowa and other states. So what we have is an understanding of why cover crops are important, and it's easier for me to talk about cover crops because my granddad used them, my dad used them. It's something that we talked about a long time ago, and we've got away from it. I think we're coming back in because we know that it's good. But cover crops are gaining popularity as a BMP because it holds the soil. So that's the soil conservation benefit, and the clean water benefit, which I'm sure you're all aware is important. From the soil health standpoint, something growing more than just the cash crop is going to extend the growing season soil activity, because of while those plants are growing and converting, they're changing the soil structure. So that goes back to soil health, which increasing soil health increases productivity in water infiltration. And so I've noticed on my own farm that where I've had cover crops, it seems like it's pulled nutrients that maybe were unreachable from my corn or soybean crop towards the surface because of the deep rooting. This is very uneducated or speculative, but this is just my what it seems like I've observed on my own farm. And of course, then the next one is that they're an alternate protein or feed source for livestock producers, which is profit. So there's several things of why it's important to have cover crops. So here's a slide that shows water running across late fall field, and Steve Berger has this on his farm, and I've accommodated or taken his photo, and I hope he'll allow that. But again, back to the benefits, keeping everything in its place, keeping it available for your crop, and not causing a problem downstream. The plant health residue, you can see this is a very common soil sample that you can see where there's a lot of activity in that root mass, from those crops growing, and that looks like very tilthy soil. So that's just another benefit. Now, obviously the what we're talking about tonight is the producer standpoint. There's also the winter food and cover for wildlife, which would be like pheasant and quail, and then opportunities for, this says Iowa businesses. Obviously, we have beyond Iowa borders, but it has been turned out to be something that some producers have made the benefit or taken advantage of to provide those. So this is a picture from of my farm. This is an early or late February seeding of oats, actually, and what your goals for your cover crops are, what your goals are, is going to tend to dictate the way you need to manage them. So for if you're just going to manage soil movement, what may look like a failed seeding is actually, it's going to do a very nice job of holding the soil. And you can see down in here these small oats, and this was probably towards the third weekend in March when these were coming up. And it was a cool spring that year, a couple years ago. But I think I have a later slide that shows what they look like a little bit later on. But in my experience, the more seed you put on, the more feed you're going to have. So now we're getting into why it's important for me as a livestock producer to have the option of managing the cover crops for forage production. So this is a view outside my across the road from my house, and this was chopped ground that we drilled rye in. And you can see the bump rows right through there where it looks a little, it's a little bit lighter, and it was a little bit lighter there because the drill was set for the other ground, and I should have taken more time. But that was a triticale seeding that I left there, and this is what it looked like. You can see how thick it was when it came up, and that was in the spring the following year. This picture is a friend of mine from Minnesota, and this is Joe was talking about the multi-species mixes, and I guess my friend Ian and I are kind of the path or like the thinking that if you have it available to you, throw it in the drill. And I think he said this is his 12 species mix, and you can see buckwheat. You can see sunflowers and I think millet, sorghum sudan grass. There's some soybeans, radishes, whatever he had, he threw in the drill, and he drilled that. And this was following an oat cowpea harvest that was close to 10 ton to the acre. That March seeded crop. He chopped it in June, came back in with this first part of July, and this was in October. And he's got 100 cow-calf pairs out on this 50 acres, and he's letting them have 3/4 of an acre at a time. So you can see over here to the right of the picture, this would be an area that's the fence is right along here, and this has been trampled and grazed, and he had those 100 cow-calf pairs on that patch for a month, right at 30 days. So that goes along with what Joe was saying, where maybe a double crop of forage crop is a definite alternative as part of the rotation. If you can feed that many cattle with that small space, that's going to help your bottom line, I think. This is on my own farm, and this is some fall seeded rye on this field right here. I turned the cows out in after they calved. This would have been right at the end of March, and you can see they're out in there. There was a lot of grass and stuff along the edge of the fence rows, and up over the hill there's an area that's non-harvested, so there's a lot of brome grass and stuff in there. But I think it's important to have areas where they can pick up that dry matter along with it, or throw some poor hay or some corn stalks or something out there where they can kind of balance their dry matter intake. So now this is uh, some information from North Dakota State, and we don't use a lot of these chemicals in Iowa. You know what we use. Joe made reference to Bob's information, but I just threw this up here, and there's 3 slides, and I'll skip through them pretty quick. But this is grazing intervals after application, and some of the ones that we're used to. I just throw out a couple examples here. Atrazine, 21 days after application. Balance flex, no, there's no restriction, but for some of these things, like Joe had mentioned, there might be a long interval, or there might be nothing that's, sunflower is part of a mix. It's not allowed under Broad Axe XL. So I think I like to use this as a reference to find out if I'm putting the right things out there, and not affecting my later harvest. But Impact, Lotus, some of those things. Liberty for forage, 60 days after application before you can harvest it, and graze the residue. So I think that's important to keep in mind, that we're not just talking about getting it up and getting it growing, but getting it have something that's legal to feed your cattle. That's got to be a concern, that in today's climate, that minute residues could start showing up in the meat if they started looking for them just from grazing after harvest, whether or not you put a cover crop out there or not. So all of this takes a tremendous amount of planning and foresight to know that at the beginning of the year you're planning for what the end of the year is going to be like when it comes to seeding your crop, seeding buying your herbicides, timing of when you're going to go back in and reseed for forage or for grazing, and then the final disposition, whether it's going to last into the next spring even. So Tim, this list is available online, I believe, on the North Dakota State website. And there's the end of that list. So there's a lot of stuff on this. This is one that's been out a while, and we're trying to understand where we're at with the cover crop. Trying to compare it to what we were doing in the past, and what we're going to continue to do. And one of the benefits I think we have as producers is the availability or the possibility of using these for a different income stream, rather than just covering the soil and from the soil health side. So from a practical standpoint of managing cover crops, when you're done, if you're just going to graze them in the fall and graze them in the spring, and you're not on a strict timetable of trying to figure out when it needs to be sprayed, when it needs to be terminated, it gives you a lot of flexibility. Things have changed when it comes to rules that the RMA, the risk management agencies, have allowed when it comes to cover crops and the interaction between those and a cash crop. And it does vary across the United States. Let me see. I do have this slide in order. So just for your information, these are zones that have been set up, and this is based on NRCS recommendations of when you would need to terminate a cover crop to not have an effect on the cash crop. So, and forgive me for going beyond the herbicide resistance, but I think it's important to have all the information when you have a chance to get it. That'll make the whole experience palatable. So most of the eastern United States, you can see that you can terminate a cover crop within 5 days after planting, but before crop emergence. So that's a pretty narrow window, and it goes to the other side that over out in the west, 35 days. I think that's what that says. It's a pretty small picture, isn't it? 35 days or earlier before planting, unless it's summer fallow. So in between there, most of Iowa is we can terminate the cover crop. In the eastern 2/3 of the state, just right at planting, and our RMA is okay with that. I'm going to say it that way. RMA is okay with that. Now, does that mean your insurance company is okay with it? Not necessarily, because they have the capability of writing rules. Um, their rules that may not allow a termination or cover crop haying and grazing. For example, you can graze it, but some may not allow haying. We're trying to make sure that we cover all of the bases as we move forward, utilizing cover crops for soil health, for soil erosion, water quality, for all the things that fit into the big picture. And part of that is making sure that we have rules that allow for use, to a producer, that the understanding that you can kill a cover crop and it's not going to have an effect on your cash crop, or that you can interplant or interseed a cover crop later in the season. It's not going to have effect on the yield, but it's going to have a payoff when it comes to fall grazing, or that some other organizations, there's a lot of discussion about labeling, and Joe mentioned the generics and how difficult it is to change labels to focus specifically on herbicide resistance, or herbicide managing the forage in a herbicide. I'm sorry, managing herbicides if you're going to use it for forage. But I think the most of the large companies now know that they can probably come out and understand how their label can be better, more explanatory to allow for the use of cover crops. Where before, and maybe in the past, they just didn't deal with it. They didn't take the time to test, and Joe had mentioned that to make sure that it was okay or not. So there are a lot of things there that we have to think about in the broad picture. I think a lot of it, like Joe said, and I referred to earlier, is just planning ahead in enough time that you don't wipe any of your options off your plate by having the wrong herbicide or something out there. So I think I'm ready for questions, Steve.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. We have plenty of time for questions, actually. So if there's any for either you, Joe, or Tim, if there's any topic that you wanted to go into a little more detail about, we do have a little time for that while people start getting their questions in the chat box. So if you do have a question, start getting it in there. But I don't know, Tim or Joe, if there's a topic you wanted to cover a little more. You certainly can.
I could, quick. Steve. Like on a couple of questions you've already had in the chat box might give me a chance to maybe make a little bit things more clear. And one of the questions was about the difference between a forage crop and a cover crop. And I guess, and maybe Tim will have some thoughts on that too, but they're the same crop, the same plant. It's just once you decide to harvest it for feed, then it changes its use. So let's say we planted cereal rye and turnips, or we planted oats and turnips. And as long as you're just using that to protect the soil, then that's what we're calling a cover crop. And honestly, most people are going to cover all of this a cover crop. But I think from the standpoint of a label, or from the herbicide use, you really need to think about it then as a forage crop. It's really a next rotational crop that's for forage once you decide you're going to graze it or harvest it for feed. So it's really the same thing. You might be planting exactly the same species, but as far as the considerations of how we're going to look at it related to those herbicides we had applied, then once we start using it for feed, then that's when we're going to start calling it a forage crop. And what Tim talked about too earlier was the North Dakota project, fact sheet that talked about even how it's restricted, how you can use forage from that targeted crop that you actually use the herbicide on based on a harvest restriction. So that's one harvest restriction, but then the next one is what's it to this rotational crop. So I think it's important to really look at that. And I didn't mention, and I've noticed on the chat too, we've had a lot of people throwing up the other ones, like Purdue's got one, Wisconsin's got one, Iowa State just came out with this one listing all the herbicides. But the reality is you really need to look at the label, because like we talked about, there's so many different tank mixes, and atrazine seems to complicate a lot of this stuff in some of these mixes, but you need to really look at the label and see, what it says on that particular label. And unfortunately, if we could hone in on maybe one or two products, we might be able to get some kind of a special use agreement and be able to change and get a label of variance on this. But otherwise, unless somebody does the real research and studies it and says how many residues are left there, you're not going to be able to get that label changed. So I guess if we had input on certain products, we really need to work with some of the companies on them. Maybe we can make a difference on that. But and my feel on the herbicide thing is just don't ignore it. I mean, I think it's one of those things that's there. If you can find a way to use a product that's really legal, and maybe that's for me teaching pesticide applicator training several years, but it's hard for me to ignore that label. I think should be hard for you to ignore that label also.
So, in addition to that, a little bit, I mentioned some of the things that we're looking at for maybe the future, and this came up into a discussion actually just last week when I was out at a national meeting. What do we need to make to accomplish our water quality, our soil health goals? The soil health is gonna affect us in our pocketbook. If we have healthy soil, we're going to probably have better crops with lower inputs. That's my pulpit, my elevator speech. But to accomplish those goals, it's going to take baby steps. Some of it's rules, some of it's understanding the labels that are out there. That maybe it's hidden information that they never put on the label, but they'd actually looked at, maybe a Bayer or a Monsanto or some of those. One thing that was brought up to me by someone I respect their opinion a lot is when do we start asking for cover crop seed or things that fit what our water quality goals are. We manage, we buy seed corn, seed beans, based on whether or not they'll handle one kind of herbicide without damage or certain bugs or things like that. And we haven't got to the point yet where we need to ask. First of all, we need to figure out what we need, and then we need to ask for it. And is that going to happen quickly? Probably not. But is it not going to happen? I don't think so. I think that if there's a need, someone will fill it. So, and that's all part of a longer-term picture. I still think that livestock producers, sheep and cattle, maybe even hogs, are well positioned to check all of the above. We can do all of these things.
Another question on there was protecting the soil from the variable impacts of climate change, and that leads after what Tim just said. But yeah, we definitely have much more volatile weather. We have much more widely ranged rains. I mean, I know that I was at a meeting last week with climatologists talking about how many more extreme rain events we've had in the last 20 years compared to the prior 100, and even how many big rains we've had in the fall. Like, good gosh, we had an awful lot of rain, didn't we, in November and December this year? So I think we're seeing a lot of rainfall, and probably even some of our prediction on soil loss are probably not really taking into account all that. So that's why having something growing out there is really big to reduce that soil erosion. And it could be a perennial forage, obviously, but if it's in a crop rotation, then using these annual forage crops as cover crops is going to be great to try to keep something growing out there and reduce that soil erosion. So even if we didn't have the soil health benefits, the soil erosion benefits are huge.
And Joe and Tim, I'm not sure which one of you would want to start by addressing Bill and Stacy's question, but I had that same question learning about this information. And if you need to be really concerned about the herbicides that you're using prior to a cover crop, what about when you see grazing on corn stalks? How does that play into this whole situation?
And that's kind of along the lines of what Tim's publication he had from North Dakota would talk more about. But a lot of these products are okay on grazing the residue. They don't specify that's a problem. You planted it and it was legal to use it on corn and it's got a harvest restriction. But I think you still, again, you got to look at the label. And there could be some individual cases that's not true, especially late season herbicide applications could be a concern. And I think Tim mentioned a couple that could be a concern. So yeah, I think it's not only the issue about how you're using the cover crop for the next crop, but also is there any kind of restriction on how soon you can graze the residue? I don't think in general it's as much of a problem as the cover crop restriction, but I think it's something you definitely need to look the label on. And Tim, I know you had some thoughts on this, I think, too.
Yeah, I think it's just something we just need to be very aware of, that we're following the rules. Typically, at least in my small sphere of where I live, is around the edge of the fields. The cows aren't locked into to residue that they'll be incidental grazing from other stuff that's there, and so whether or not there's going to be anything in there that would be damaging the cattle, I don't know. From a scientific standpoint, but the thing is go with the label recommendations till you find out that it's different. So I think Jake has got a question that you probably answer very well, Joe.
Okay, yeah, I do think they'll still eat. This question is about the rate of passage and this really high energy feed. And number one, it depends on what kind of animal you have. First of all, I wouldn't be too concerned about the cattle just being loose. I mean, obviously, I think they're going to be. This stuff is really, really high moisture. I think to say you're going to have this perfect rate of passage isn't going to probably happen. But we're just trying to avoid this really extreme problems. So number one, I'd try to have a mix that included grass and the brassica, or grass and legume, so we kind of handle a little bit of it that way. And then if I thought even then that it was too rich, then I probably would consider just putting out some roughage. And I think you can see a lot of examples where even though the cattle have a really high quality feed, they still like to go back and get a little bit more fiber somewhere else. So I think they will eat enough of it that would help. And I think I'd personally just would graze them, and I wouldn't be putting and taking them necessarily. I think I'd try to get them adapted to the feed that's out there and let them graze it. And maybe I'd limit how much. I think strip grazing it and giving them what you think they need, rather than letting them just continue to pick over the best of all, but would always be helpful in these situations. So no, I think I would. I personally would not, let them out there in the day and take them in at night. I don't believe I'd do that. I think I'd let them graze. That'd be my opinion.
Where I've noticed it's probably the best luck is where I had high stubble, from a triticale harvest, for example. And went back in and drilled multi-species. Then they can actually, they're going to pick up some residue from that straw, while they're grazing. They've balanced their own diet. They've balanced their own dry matter intake, I think, by having that in there. You're going to find that probably even more apparent if you're grazing something that's grown into corn stalks. That they pick a lot. They'll pick. You'll see one with the green stuff hanging out of their mouth with a shuck at the same time. So they're kind of balancing it out, I think, as they go along.
And one thing I'd mention too about the chart I showed you with the sulfur and with the really high energy, when Mary presented that in Cresta, man, I have a lot of respect for the raised sheep longer than I've raised sheep even, and he said he grazed brassicas and never had any trouble with toxicity on the sheep. And I think it'd be unusual to get to the point you'd have toxicity. It's just more, did you utilize it as well as you could have? Not to say it couldn't happen. Obviously, there's some cases it could happen, but I think as a whole, people have done this an awful lot and not got along too bad. It's just try to find a way to make it as balanced as you can.
I would think one other thing to add is be sure that you're having a discussion with your extension specialist or your veterinary. Make sure that their mineral. It might be, especially with spring grazing, might be a magnesium deficiency or something like that, and that will show up in grazing these really lush, fast-growing crops in the spring.
Yeah, I think grass tetany could be a problem even in the fall with these kind of really lush crops, especially places where you had high fertility. So I think it's one of those deals that you want to make sure you thought your mineral program through really well too, and make sure they'll really get something they'll eat.
Doesn't look
I'm
like there's any
surprised to
more.
see that it looks like the chat box has slowed down a little bit. I thought that we'd be getting bombarded with questions here on this topic tonight. So don't be shy, folks. If you have some questions, we got two guys that might have an answer here. So I don't know, Tim or Joe, is there Joe? I can always pull up your presentation again if there's a slide that you wanted to reference again and get into more detail about. We still have plenty of time here if you wanted.
Well, I think we can just talk a little bit more about, we've obviously focused a lot on cattle here, but I think all the other, like Tim mentioned, sheep could be a real good possibility with this stuff, and that was honestly my experience much more in my farming career was with grazing sheep on rye after, and had really good luck with that, and then also harvested silage and used it in my farm. And the thing you can't ignore the fact is that all these annual forage crops are just great ways to get a lot of production that you wouldn't have had otherwise. So I think there's a lot of good opportunities out there, not only with beef, but for other animals.
So we've talked about this a little bit, Joe, in the past. I use a lot of clover in my rotations, and what I have done once, I haven't had the opportunity because the timing wasn't right, but went out with rye and interseeded it after I took the first cutting of clover off, and then drilled rye in with it. And of course the clover came back, but the rye came up, and it just about doubled my tonnage. That was in a haying situation. That would have, I chopped that, but that was just something I wanted to try and just see if it would work. And the clover came back a little bit slow. It was a little thinner stand, and the rye got up and shot out of the ground, and that was a real nice mix. Cows loved the heck out of it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good opportunities to even renovate some pastures or some hay ground that's not that great by using some of these annuals, different mixes of them. And we certainly have had some people that we were working with at the research farm were wanting to try some of some mixes they had with some annual forage crops to use following in a calving pasture to try to get a big boost. Obviously, you already got a lot of nutrients there, and then you could go out there and get something to grow really good. And like you mentioned, if you had that clover and then you get that grass to grow right with it, it'd be wonderful. I think we could have a lot of good combinations. And I don't know if Bruce is the Bruce Carney that I know, that's the Bruce on here, but I know he's done a lot of things to try to put those annual crops in some places and pastures to try to renovate those, make those stronger. Hopefully it's help the soil benefits. So I think, there's definitely a difference on that. One of the questions you have there too, is there a yield or difference between rye and triticale? Well, rye is just going to come on earlier. Rye is going to probably yield more in the spring, especially if it's for grazing and early harvest. If you're going to go a little longer and get more growth, then triticale might actually yield more and have a little bit higher quality than rye. But rye is going to be, if your goal is to try to get something early and get it off and then get your soybean crop planted, then rye probably is a little bit better and yields more. It's going to produce more, but probably not quite the quality that triticale or wheat will have.
Yeah, I've managed rye and triticale both ways, and I found out it's a lot easier for the cows to take it off. The picture I had where the cows were I wish I'd have had the slide in there and so I could show what it looked like later. But this field right here that I've got on the screen, that field I grazed those cows for almost 30 days, and till the 1st of May, sprayed it and planted it by the 15th of May, and that would have been in 2014, and that corn made over 200 bushel an acre. And so not counting, I obviously had to deal with I was dealing with short rye because the cows had kept it grazed off, so it was easy to kill. Went in with a quart of glyphosate and 2,4-D, and didn't have to go back. I didn't have to spray that again. There was enough residue, enough ground cover there that shot out of the corn shot out of the ground, and did very well from there on. And I was a little bit concerned about the compaction. If there was going to be some compaction, but it was a dry spring, or fairly dry spring, and so that wasn't an issue up to that point. It got wetter later on, but I think if there's one thing that we could maybe look at is how much compaction is there really with the root mass of a growing cover crop? You're going to get some pock marks and stuff like that, but I wonder if you're going to have compaction that's really going to affect a crop down deep, that we used to worry about.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's enough root system. It's probably not near as concerned as some people think. And one question, I guess it looks at Bill and Stacy, you're talking about the economics, about financial cost with a producer. And one thing, I guess, one issue here too is how much when they're grazing, let's say it's rye after corn stalk, in corn stalk, so you got both the corn residue and rye, then how much rye they're eating and how much corn stalks they're eating. And I know that Nebraska's looking a little bit on trying to sort that out, on how much are we getting out of each thing. But I think it's difficult to come up with this financial agreement on any kind of a grazing agreement between a crop farmer and a livestock farmer. But I think that obviously would be the great place for us to get. The convincing the crop farmer that those cattle grazing out there actually be beneficial to their soil, and probably actually do a little bit of a demonstration of how that works, was probably going to be very helpful. I think that there should be a good relationship between somebody helping do the seeding, because you're going to get a chance to use that forage, and then also helping the farmer, get the cover crop on there and get better soil health. It should be the case. I don't know that we have a real good financial package to do that. We've done a lot of stuff on custom grazing, and I think it may be so much of a head per day basis on what you're going to pay somebody, just because there's so much variation in the weather. I don't think you want to be committed to a big payment to graze cover crops on a neighbor's farm unless you've got some way to kind of have a adjustment based on just extreme weather that won't allow you to do it, or a year that it doesn't take. So I think that's one of our concerns would be. But your question is very good, Bill and Stacy, that we need to figure out better partnerships between crop farmers and people with the livestock and make that beneficial to both.
Guest question. I think, Joe, you would have a good answer for that, and the next one kind of runs along that same line. We're going to have trouble with probably a fall seeding of a species that's going to be a legume and put much nitrogen in unless you let it grow well into the next spring. But that's just from from an onlooker standpoint. I know, Joe, you could add more to that.
Yeah, I think that's the one problem, is that even though I think most people are trying to advocate using a legume, we have such a short season when we're talking about maybe October 1st or even September 1st on. I think we're going to get much benefit from that legume is a little questionable, and I think that work that Sarah's done with PFI would back that up. It's really hard for us to compare what we're doing to some place where it's following wheat, and they can have a much longer season, and if you even look at the stuff I showed you from Nebraska, some of that definitely had better luck, following wheat. So I think the legumes are a little difficult to think you're going to get much. Now, on the other hand, if you're going back to what we talked about earlier with that double cropping of a forage system, that having a legume in there on something that you could plant earlier could be very beneficial. And I would say I would probably just look at a combination of both the legumes and the brassicas, of trying to hold those down to to a reasonable percentage of the stand compared to the grass that was in there, and that's what I'd probably look at more. And there's some seeding rate recommendations certainly on that Nebraska publication I showed you, and other places like that. But the thing to keep in mind is these seeds on especially those brassicas are really small, so it doesn't take very much of it to get a lot of seed compared to cereal rye or wheat or something like that. So it's a lot different kind of thing depending on what you got in there and how many pounds it takes. And I think it comes down to the cocktail mix and the balance of the different species. If it's all the agronomics, then I think there's a lot of people that believe there's a lot to that. I don't think anybody has any real data to show how many species really need to be in that mix. Is 14 really better than 10, or is 10 really better than 6? I think if you're going to do something and get enough growing season, it's good to have something from the three functional groups, which would be legume and the brassica and the grass. It'd be great to have that in there. It's just how many of them do you need? I think there's also certain things in those cocktail mixes that has almost no benefit to the cattle. I don't think that there's a lot of benefit to some of those as far as feed, and some of it there's a tremendous benefit. So it really depends on what you're doing. And the other thing another question down there a little bit about beneficial insects is, some of the things when we had more rotations, we had a lot more diversity in all kinds of species, and certainly more opportunities for like not only for the insects but also for birds that would use those insects. I think when we had more small grains in our rotations, we had a lot more diversity, and I think this is when we were going to get the diversity back, even though we got a dominated corn soybean rotation system. By having these legumes, some of these other type species show up there in the intervals will be a big plus in a lot of different ways on diversity.
A quick answer to Jake on compaction. Yes, do no-till following grazing, following the grazing period. One thing I don't have any benefit of is actually managing, a rye or a triticale by rolling, because it never gets that tall before I need to put another crop in. But definitely, once I burn it down, um, and the ground's right, I'd plant right into it. So that question, and then a comment you made, Joe, about talking about the double crop forage. Um, I think it's important to think about can we change our if we get more production out of land, if we target some areas that might be good from several aspects, ergonomically sound, maybe a little delicate when it comes to the land structure, where it might be more susceptible to soil erosion or something like that. Maybe we can throw that extra rotation in there with something that's soil to mouth, for the cow. They're gonna make the best use of it, and I think there's gonna be soil and water quality benefits that'll be long lasting. Last comment, real quick, is when I think about or not herbicide mixes, but seeding mixes for throwing something out there, nothing's off the table for me. If I've got it in a bag in the shed, I'm going to probably throw it in the drill and mix it in. I may have to hit part of it twice because I don't get it set right the first time, as much as I want. But like I said earlier, seed makes feed, and if you think about maybe nobody else has this problem, but my cows like to get out once in a while, and if you watch what they go after when they're out of the pasture, they pretty much go after everything, and they go from plant species to plant species to eat, because it's like going to Sunday buffet. Excuse me. Sorry about that. You think we covered everything, Joe?
I don't know. It looks like we wore them out. I think
Must
probably.
have wore them out.
Yeah, you guys did a great job building those questions here in the chat box. We can give it another minute to see if there's anything last minute that comes up, but yeah, I think maybe you did exhaust them.
Yeah,
Uh,
I that last picture I threw up. I'm gonna go to that real quick. I'm kind of proud of that. That's actually my dad, and had one of the first
oh,
four-wheel drives back in the late 30s. But on the back of it, you can see that was his plow. That was a four-wheel drive Massey GP. This would have been late 30s, early 40s. It was probably in the 40s, but uh, he very well could have been plowing in green manure. And that's what we have now with cover crops. I think it's just we've forgotten what we call it back then. We've got ways to manage them, but I know my dad. I can remember plowing in green manure with snow on it, even when the weather was right. But plowing may not be the best option overall, but it's not new. What we're doing is this is just not new stuff. Can we do a better job? Can we make it better? I'm sure we can, but that I think that's something that scares some people. Why why we're talking about cover crops and that, not this audience, I'm sure, but good comment, guest, like that.
Great. Well, I guess that's probably a good opportunity to wrap it up then. Joe and Tim, thanks so much for providing all your insight and preparing these presentations. Um, if, like I said, we're going to have this archived within a couple days, so between me and our guest who provided a bunch of links, there should be some other stuff to follow up on if you get a chance to go back through this presentation, click those links, and follow up on some of this other stuff. Thanks everybody for joining us on another Tuesday night for this Farminar. Joe and Tim, thank you so much. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I hope we provided some good information.
Yeah, thank you very much.